Well, unfortunately, we don't have an accurate idea of how widespread this problem is. It usually occurs when the industrial solvents used by pharma companies to manufacture syrups contain certain traces of diethylene glycol or ethylene glycol. Now, in the case of India, the government of India hasn't been very transparent. It's not conducted a transparent investigation. So, as a result, we just don't know how many companies in India have used the contaminated industrial solvent to manufacture cough syrups.
Are there still immediate concerns for consumers?
Absolutely, because depending on how many companies have used this contaminated solvent, it's very possible that the scale of the problem is actually much larger, which is why it's necessary for the WHO and the Indian government to conduct more transparent investigations so that we can identify all the pharma companies which have used the solvent in question.
How could this happen in the first place? Are there not enough checks, adequate checks in place to ensure such mistakes don't happen?
Well, typically what happens is that companies buy these industrial solvents from normal chemical traders, and these chemical traders sell these solvents at different grades of purity. So for industrial use, there's one grade of purity. For pharmaceutical use, they're sold at a higher grade of purity. And at times, there are mistakes made at the trader's end. But this issue of contamination with DEG is very well known in the pharma industry, because of which the good manufacturing practices require pharma companies to test for contamination. When they fail to test for contamination is when we see such cases take place. Now, in India, at least the company which was implicated in the Gambian incident, where 72 children died, had a terrible track record when it came to manufacturing quality medicine, and that was well known to Indian regulatory authorities. They just didn't take any action against the company. So it's a question of basically very poor regulation of the pharma industry in India.
Well, tell us a bit more about why India's drug manufacturers aren't being held to account for these deaths.
Well, the problem is, the government of India is very invested in seeing the Indian pharma industry grow. It's one of the few manufacturing success stories, and the government of India doesn't want to sully that image. So the typical the reflexive bureaucratic reaction when there is a scandal is to try and deny it and try to cover it up, lest, the world thinks that there is actually a quality problem with the Indian industry. So it's a very short-sighted, myopic approach to a very complicated problem.
How often do we see such mass poisoning events due to contamination?
Well, they've been taking place in the developing world with a lot of frequency. The first mass poisoning incident took place in 1937 in the United States, and the US has never had a repetition of that. India has had 5 since 1970, between 1970 and 2020. Adding up these 2 incidents in Gambia and Uzbekistan, that goes up to 7 incidents. So this is a problem that's recurring in a country which likes to boast that it is the pharmacy of the world. And the fact that nobody is trying to solve the problem or tackle it seriously should be very concerning for the global community, which imports medicines from India in large volumes.
Well, the WHO is asking for member states to take immediate and coordinated action. So what else can be done to ensure this doesn't happen again?
Well, somebody needs to... I think the problem is in India, we're not going to see any change, because the Indian government has denied that the company which was implicated in the Gambian incident actually did anything wrong, despite seeing the deaths of 72 children. So I don't see much changing within India at the behest of the Indian government. The international community needs to take steps, perhaps, on having an international regulatory framework to ensure that medicines traded between different countries are of a certain quality. Right now, there is absolutely no international regulatory framework ensuring the quality of drugs.
But you've called for a centralised federal authority to govern drug manufacturing laws. Tell us more about what you propose.
Yeah, so India has, one of the big problems in India is that we have a very fragmented system of regulation, wherein every state has its own regulator, plus the central or federal government has its own regulators. So we have a system of about 37 regulators, and that just causes a lot of turf wars and a lot of inefficiencies within the system. So there's been a long pending proposal in India to try and centralize these regulatory systems within, one agency. But more important than centralization, I think, is the Indian system needs to be far more transparent. Right now, it's very difficult to figure out whether regulatory agencies are even doing their jobs. So I think more than centralization, we would really pitch for far greater transparency in how the entire regulatory system works.
Prashant Reddy, great to have this conversation. Thank you so much.